Hey everybody, welcome back to the Captain's Coffee. I'm David, and today we're going to go over one of our most requested roasting templates, light roasting for natural processed coffees with the trusty SR800. Now, usually this is in reference to natural Ethiopian coffees, but this recipe is a great starting point for just about any natural processed coffee. Before we get into that, we'll briefly talk about what natural processed coffee is, why it's different, as well as discuss the key things to understand when roasting it. But if you'd like to skip straight to the recipe, there'll be timestamps in the description below and along the plate progress bar. Also, don't forget to check our other guides for the SR800 for more tips and tricks. We'll leave a link to that playlist in the description below as well. And just before we dive in today, if you'd like to support us making helpful guide videos like this one, you can pick up green coffee, roasted coffee, brewers, grinders, all kinds of coffee stuff at thecaptainscoffee.com. And remember to like this video. It's a free way to support us, and we really do appreciate it. All right, let's get into it. So, before we can talk about how to roast natural processed coffee, it's important to understand what it is. The most common processing technique for coffee is called fully washed. This is where the fruit of the coffee cherry is completely removed and washed off of the coffee beans before they're allowed to dry. Natural processing is also called dry processing because the fruit or pulp of the coffee cherry is left to dry on the beans, usually for several weeks before it's removed. The chemical process that happens during this long drying time is complicated, but simply put, all this time with the fruit and the coffee bean together has a significant impact on the final flavor of the cup. There are lots of variations in natural processing as well as methods that are a mix of traditional natural and wash processing, like honey processing, wet hulling, and lots more. Natural processing imparts coffee with really fruity flavors. Commonly, these flavors tend to come in the form of ripe berries, such as blueberry and raspberry, but you can also find stone fruits such as peach and nectarine. These big, juicy, fruity flavors are usually really heavy and sweet, and they frequently overshadow any sparkling or acidic flavors you might usually find in washed coffees. In contrast to the fruity sweetness, natural processing also usually imparts earthy characteristics, which creates a complex flavor profile. We often use words like intense, funky, and twisty to describe the way these fruity and earthy flavors combine to create some really fun and flavorful cups. The most common and famous origin for natural processed coffee is Ethiopia, where it's used on local heirloom coffee varieties to great effect. But the same could be said of Brazil, which also almost always natural processes, but until recent years, Brazil was an exception among its South American neighbors. However, since the explosion in popularity of specialty coffee, natural processing has also grown in popularity, and now you can find producers in nearly every coffee region experimenting with it, often with great success. So before we get into the recipe, let's talk about some basic principles when roasting natural processed coffee. These are really just guidelines, but they might be helpful for you when you're trying to make the recipe your own. First is roast level. Natural processed coffees tend to be at their best in the light to medium or city to full city range. Heirloom varieties from Ethiopia are a bit more susceptible to heat, and we tend to prefer sticking to the lighter end of the spectrum with them. Naturals from the Americas are a bit more dense and robust, so you consider taking them closer to medium. Finally, naturals from Indonesia are typically the most dense and will favor medium roasting as well, but we'd still shy away from going any further than full city plus in order to preserve the natural flavors inherent to natural processing. Our next consideration is total roast time. If our roasts are too quick, we risk roasting the outside of the bean while leaving the inside underdeveloped. We also don't want to be timid with our heat and end up baking the beans, leaving them dull and bitter. It's important to cool the roast a little bit from our usual protocol, but if we overdo it, the beans will never gain enough momentum to make it to first crack in a reasonable amount of time. On the SR800, that means we want to aim for about a total roast time of 7 to 8 minutes. If you have a different roaster, your total time may vary, but the point is to be on the shorter end of your typical acceptable roast time spectrum. Naturals tend to be a bit more susceptible to high heat, So we like to start the roast a tad cooler than we usually would, especially for softer beans from Brazil, which are lower grown. This plays well into our desired roast level and keeps the more fragile beans from taking off and either scorching or tipping. However, just like we discussed, we don't want to stall or bake our roast, so while we start lower than usual, we'll need to keep driving the heat up in small increments to gently get the beans the thermal momentum they need. That means more heat adjustments early on. Keep in mind if you're using a drum roaster rather than a fluid bed roaster like the SR800, this process would be quite different, but that's for another video. Natural processed coffee is extremely chaffy. The process leaves more silver skin, or chaff, stuck to the beans after it's finished, so you should expect lots of chaff to come off during roasting. Be sure to clean your chaff collector out between each roast and never try to load your roaster over its intended capacity when you're roasting naturals. Finally, some basic reminders on best practices when using the SR800 for any roast. Make sure you're using a power outlet that's on a 20 amp or higher circuit. Check your ambient temperature to ensure it's above about 60 degrees. And if you're roasting inside, turn on your oven's exhaust fan or roast near an open window. We go over all these tips and tricks in more detail in our SR800 Beginner's Guide, so check that out in the link in the description below for more. Now that we're familiar with the basics of natural processed coffee and important considerations for roasting it, it's time to share a sample roast using our template. Now keep in mind, this is not the be-all, end-all recipe for roasting naturals. It's our starting point that we use to gauge adjustments on how each origin needs to be roasted to bring out the best it has to offer. For best results, always keep a roast log noting your adjustments during the roast and keep notes of which roasts taste the best. Because at the end of the day, all that matters is that you like your coffee. Now let's get roasting.
Start by weighing out 225 grams or 8 ounces of coffee. Today we're going to be roasting a classic heirloom Ethiopian natural from an amazing organic farmer, Beratu Jabicho. So we're going to start off the fan set all the way up at 9 because the beans are really heavy and difficult to get moving at room temperature. And we'll start our heat out really low at 3 to prevent the beans in the bottom from getting scorched. Hit start run and start your timer as well. Alright, let's give those beans some time to warm up and to start moving around a little more. After about a minute, the beans are up and moving, so we can reduce our fan to 8 because it's time to feed some more heat into the system. I don't want to turn up the power on the heater yet because decreasing the fan has already fed a pretty good amount of heat into the system. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make small but frequent adjustments when roasting natural processed coffees to allow them time to acclimate to the heat. At about the 2-minute mark, the beans are moving quite well again, and it's time to increase our heat again by decreasing our fan to 7. At this point, the beans are starting to get acclimated to the heat, and we can start driving up our power to feed them the necessary amount of thermal energy they need to get to first crack. So after a few more seconds, I'm going to go ahead and do that by increasing the power to 4. As you can see, just before the 4-minute mark, we're passing the drying phase since the beans are now almost uniformly yellow and we're entering the Maillard phase of the roast. I'm not ready to add in a significant amount of heat because I don't want to fly through the important chemical processes of Maillard phase too quickly, so I'm going to opt for a small power increase to 5 while leaving the fan at 7. Just before 5 minutes, our beans are now well acclimated to the heat in the system, and we need to add a big chunk of heat to get the beans over the hump into first crack in a reasonable time. So I'm going to reduce the fan to 6. We're finally just about to hit first crack, and I want to feed the roaster just a bit more heat to be sure we don't stall during first crack. So I make one final adjustment by increasing the power to 6. There we go, we've got a nice first crack since I've heard several cracks in quick succession. I want to pull this roast light at around city, so I'm going to let the first crack continue for about 35 to 45 seconds before I switch to cool and end the roast. I've had a nice rolling crack for 45 seconds now, and I know I'll get a few more cracks once I hit cool, since the SR800 takes a little bit to power down the heating element, and our beans look perfect. We're gonna fast forward through the long cooling cycle, but note that I continually increase the fan while the beans cool to keep them moving and cooling quickly. Be sure to stick around to the end because I've got a really cool tip to share with you at the end of the cooling phase. Alright, we're close to the end of the cooling phase, and it's time for a quick tip. Like I mentioned before, naturals are really chaffy, and when the fan stops, there's a tendency for a lot of that chaff to fall back into the roasted coffee. One way to prevent this is to turn your fan down by half during the last 30 seconds of the cooling phase, grab some oven mitts or heat-resistant gloves, and remove the chaff collector early. Be careful, the lid is going to be really hot. This is best done outside since some chaff will be blown everywhere, but at least it won't get in your roasted coffee. If you're roasting inside, like inside your garage, you can also use a shop vac to help with easy cleanup.
So there you have it, our starter template recipe for roasting natural processed coffees. I really hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please leave us a like below, subscribe for more coffee roasting and brewing guides. If you have more questions about roasting naturals or Ethiopian coffees, leave us a comment below. We really do read all our comments and try to respond to them quickly. Oh, and share your tips and tricks for others in the comments as well. So that's all for today, friends. Thanks for watching, and happy roasting.